Good morning once more. What a lovely morning. Thank you so much, Program Director, with your opening remarks, talking largely on the issues of ethics, something that we'll have to talk about when we have our coffee, how we conduct ourselves as professionals in the professional sector. I would like to firstly appreciate the President in absentia, again, the leadership of SICFARO present today. Also to thank you for a great opportunity that you have provided to all of us to come and share ideas, fast-tracking, progressing to ensure that when we go back, we at least have a knowledge on how to better ourselves as we conduct our work in our little space. Program Director, allow me to just highlight, I'm gonna have an updated presentation that I will share. This is because we are progressive, so we have listened to some of the comments that were made yesterday. But most importantly, what is important for us is just to make sure that we are addressing what we are supposed to be doing. So my topic today, it will be covering probity. And this is some of the advisory role that we need to start to think about when we conduct our normal audits. There has been a move in the technology space, so we have to also align ourselves as assurers when we conduct our audits. Briefly, my presentation again, it will touch base a bit of introduction. Probity is highly regulated. So there is legislation enough to, support how we're supposed to execute this from all spheres of government. This is very important. That's why you would realize that sometimes some of the challenges that we have, it's how we interpret legislation and how we apply it back. Bit of benefits there, and really the role of advisory that we need to play. I think yesterday, the President also made mention of the fact that we need to move away from just conducting assurance services. We need to start thinking about advisory because our control environment is not improving. We are raising similar findings year in, year out. And as a result, you find that the challenges that we have, they just persist. The problem statement that I came about to in drafting this presentation was to look at how are we performing as municipalities, but I've later then upgraded my presentation to also include all spheres of government. My analysis also with that reflected the same conclusions that I've made, that we still have issues around supply chain management, issues around procurement management. Regardless of how highly we are regulated, we're still struggling to get it right. And I'll appreciate some of the colleagues that have been making representation to say they are cleaning their own municipalities within the supply chain space. That is greatly appreciated. We need to share those ideas amongst ourselves, just to ensure that as we leave, we integrate and we're able to have a proper action plan to implement. Some of the issues that have been raised around your Auditor General or your internal audit, it relates to your inadequacy of supply chain management policies, lack of proper documentation, issues around declaration, conflict of interest, issues around your procurement processes in line as far as the committees is concerned, You're looking at insufficient training that it's there to equip some of our practitioners to be able to conduct their work as they run the procurement process. And a bit of, an overuse of the deviation process. It's one of the critical aspects that we have. We do understand that in the space, at some point, you will have to deviate when you are procuring services. But there are clear guidelines how one must, or what is a qualified deviation. And time and again, we would forever have issues in justifying why were we deviating from a process. Because we might come and say, this is not an emergency, it's not an agency. Looking at the fact that probably we were supposed to plan proper. And I will have to try and emphasize this because we need to look at our supply chain process planning turnaround times. And I'm saying this because if you start planning at the beginning of the financial year, chances are you are going to procure later in the year. So when do you have time to really implement your services? Because if you do your demand management processes, your acquisition processes before the beginning of the financial year, in Q1, you should start delivering services. And those are some of the bottlenecks that we need to unblock and make sure that we assist management in understanding that the cycle of procurement, it cannot be all the time that it starts at the beginning of the financial year, especially because of our planning documents that would have been approved timeously. Bit of legislation there touching on MFMA and PFMA that governs your financial management in the public sector, promoting transparency, accountability, and good governance. We have our Constitution, our Bible, Holy Bible, that guides the process. And we have also some of the internal audit frameworks that guides how internal audit should really execute this function. Critical to the municipalities as well, the prompt of Probity Audits, it gives, in line with Circular 62, at the discretion of the accounting officers, there is a need for internal audit to conduct these audits before they can even award or before they can conclude the procurement processes. And these are some of the issues that we have to deliberate on. We have been in the after effect processes. We identify findings after the process has been concluded, but the value add there, it's limited because once the process is concluded, we are ballooning with the irregular expenditure. Regardless of the audits that we'll do after effects, we'll still have to go through the process of now complying with the Circular 68 around your irregular investigate. So we're creating more work over and above the work that we have. So why Probity Audit? Section 217, as I've highlighted, is very clear to say that when governance procedures needs to be followed, but what is key from 217 is that the procurement of goods and services needs to be done in a fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and in a cost-effective manner. How do we unbundle that? Very important back to our officers, because fairness to us, it means everybody should be represented in the process. The transparency part means that we should to be open about how we are driving the procurement processes. The public at some point need to take part. We need to make sure that our processes are intact before we can even start to have communication with the community, because that's where our trust relies on. If we don't have this clearly articulated, that's why we have issues around the community actually trusting our processes. Probity in the procurement processes provide an assurance on whether procurement was conducted in a manner that results in a fair, equitable, transparent, and competitive in terms of your supply chain practices. Reinforcement in the tendering process, it's important as organizations are often involved in high value and complex tenders that are critical to service delivery. And I think we will have to spend a bit of time there having to unpack the complexity and the resources that one should consider when we adopt to conduct the probity audits. If effectively managed, probity enhance the public confidence in the organization's procurement processes. Because when everything is outlined, it's in the public, it's justified, there's evidence, then you are gaining public trust in your procurement processes, and it manages the risks that we forever have around your supply chain of whether fraud, corruption. Those are some of the risks that are really eminent in that space. One of the critical things perhaps that we will consider later is just to make sure that when we conduct these audits, we are clear, because there is a differentiation between your assurance, your advisory, and your consulting. But in this presentation, I think I tried to make sense of both your advisory and consulting, looking at our own internal audit standards and vis-a-vis what we are doing on the ground. Some of the objectives of probity, really, I've spoken a lot about those. But key to it is that the probity is performed prior to the awarding of the tender. So we are not going to wait for the process to be concluded. We need to be part of the process. And I would outline that because I know there will be issues about independence, objectivity impaired, and what can we do in that scenario if really we want to follow this process. But largely, it seeks to provide your independent assurance and advice, especially on your compliance with relevant legislations. Accountability and responsibility is greatly enhanced when we conduct these audits, because we are able to identify where the critical weaknesses would have been during the procurement process, be it from a bid specification process, be it from an evaluation process, or on an adjudication process. It enhances the public and bidders' confidence. I think I've spoken about that. Some benefits of it, the criticality of the benefits here. One thing that we can take from probity is it serves as a proactive measure, one of the preventative controls that you guys can have, because you are proactive in managing your risks around procurement. It really enhances enforced compliance. With a lot of circulars that we appreciate and get from National Treasury with so many deadlines for implementation and all that, if we don't cascade them properly in our organizations, that result is non-compliance, and you forever have issues around. You're supposed to include issues of local content this year, next year. No, we are no longer including those. We are moving away from these processes. So we need to have a built-in process to try and circumvent those, and probity seeks to try and align and clear that. Apart from that, it serves as a measure to integrate. I don't want to call the name, but I've been talking about combined assurance. So it's another preventative measure if you have to look at that. So before we can even talk about how do we conduct it, we have looked at the different differentiation or definition of what do we term as advisory and vis-a-vis your consulting. And from different materials that I've read, that you have made reference to, services through which internal auditors provide advice to an organizational stakeholders without providing assurance on taking management responsibilities. That's what our internal audit standard says as it pertains to advisory. It's concerned with ensuring the integrity, the transparency, and fairness in the process, especially in the public sector, on projects and your procurement. That's part of advisory. What set a distinct measure between the two is the fact that with advisory, it requires an involvement of ongoing relationships where your advisors monitor the process through and through and provides insight throughout the projects. So you'd appreciate the fact that with this definition, you will need advisors that would have to continuously develop themselves around the space, make sure that they research, make sure that they are aligned with the policies, the legislations, be it in our little municipalities or metros, but you have to have people who are proactive in that space. And consulting really, it's timed. So it looks at the specific expertise, and then it looks like you conduct the audits or assessment of existing practices and procedures, and those are project specific and defined within the timelines. But what I can make out of the two definition is the fact that with advisory, you are continuously have to develop ourselves, but you strategically advise the practitioners within the procurement space as it pertains to legislation, processes, any changes, and some of the criticalities that they have to look for during the process of procurement. What are things that you need to look at when you consider probity audits? Because one of the colleagues was saying, are we not going to be impaired as we commence with this process and later audit it? So you'll have to look at your organization as usual. You have to assess your structure of your organization. This will allow to determine the extent of resources that you require to run the process. Furthermore, also, you have to now trigger bid your internal audit plan, so you need to have a probity plan as well. This is derived from your demand management and acquisition documents. So once the budget is approved, you have your IDPs, it's clearly articulated, your capital projects that are there, you have to use those and start planning for your probities, because that is very key. All the projects that are going through a procurement processes, we have to look at them. That's where we start considering the value of the projects themselves to just determine the resources that we'll need to conduct this. Once you're done with that, then you can assess and decide, I don't have resources, perhaps I need to outsource some of these probities, especially because of the specialized field and the criticality. If you look at some of the capital projects that we deliver in the public sector, it requires certain speciality. So over and above your normal skills around procurement processes, you still have to do a bit of work to try and align. So if they are talking about a different project, or they're talking about going out to get an insurance for an organization, as auditors, we are all rounders, but we are not specialists in those. So we would need some time to get outsourcing services to try and get people who are relevant that will advise in the process. When you start conducting it from a planning process, you're still going to follow your methodology. I've spoken about methodology, I think on Monday, highlighting the need of defining a framework for this kind of services, or your probity audits specific. The reason being because of when you follow your audit methodology, you would need to outline, are you doing an assurance, are you doing an advisory? If you're doing an advisory, what are the steps that you are following? And in this case, what methods are you going to apply? Because with probity advisory, it guides the process through and through. So if it takes 3 months to be concluded, you have to be part of the process. You can't just say, I did one set and I'm out. Until the procurement processes are concluded, then we can finally say we have contributed to the process. It starts from, as I've highlighted, from a demand management until we award tenders. Different from your normal assurance when you do your probity, where you just look at the processes that has been followed before they award, or at the time they will provide information once they've awarded. So you're still gonna do your methodology, looking at your Your scope, I've shared some few insights in terms of what to look out for when you do your scoping documents, your executing and continuous. But critical to this, colleagues, is the fact that you have to decide as an internal audit department whether you're going to allocate internal resources that you're going to equip internally to drive probity audits. And so you make sure that once they are done, they are focusing on probity and nothing else. If you're going to have all-rounders auditors, then that's where we're going to have a bit of challenges because, in terms of the standard, you can't be a player and a referee. That's why you have to consider other methods of really outsourcing or insourcing or just having a dedicated team that will work around. Some of the scoping, when we conduct this from a bit specification stage, you need to make sure that the processes were followed. So we are not going to issue a finding, no, there are no appointment letters, no, there are no minutes. You are part of the process. As you sit, as the BSC sit, deliberate on the matters, they deliberate on the requirements of the projects, you have to strategically advise. So you need to be prepared and prepare and in line with making sure that you are aligning with your policies. You are providing a strategic advice. You are not participating in the process. Two different things. You are playing a very strategic advice from an advisory role on what they need to do as a committee. But the committee will still have to be accountable for the resolutions that they take. This is very important in the process. In the bid evaluation stage, it's the same procedures. These are some of the things that you look. You make sure that you review and confirm the bid advertisements process. You really, is my time up? All right, but I'm close to there. Thank you for the 5 minutes. So these are some of the scoping documents that you will do. I wanted to focus on that because I think it's a guide for all of us to try and make sense of why we need to do it and how we need to do it. But taking the fact that you have to report throughout the process, so you have to have 2 reports or 3 reports, one from the BSC bid specification process that outlines what happened there, what were your observations there, what were some of the resolutions that you have noted there. And then you also have another report that you will produce on the BEC that will talk about, what were the criteria used, has there been consistently uniformity in scoring, in evaluating, especially when there are tenders that requires a demonstration in IT, where you're gonna need extra services to try and make sure that the process is followed. We are trying to manage the risk of litigations. You find that at a certain point, the evaluation process has not been consistently applied. As a result, you find that there are so many issues that now attached to the municipality, mainly in the procurement space. Lesson learned from this is one, we need to have continuous training to develop this. We need adequate resources to make sure that we are aligned. In our area, so we have a separate section for probity auditors that will drive probity audits, and we will normally have our own internal auditors that will later do the supply chain management processes. So the results of probity then it will influence the scoping of the normal supply chain management processes. So not to ensure that we don't duplicate effort, but you are going to require investment, a continuous investment in terms of how you are going to resource your staff. Back to the theme today, we have to have some technology in and making sure that the e-procurement is there. There are some organizations that are using e-procurement, like ourselves. We have started with the e-procurement process just to try and integrate demand management to audit. It makes really life easy when you get to assess this information. Some of the interventions that we are recommending really is just to have that methodology, make sure that 2 things that are very critical and that I think they've been raised even yesterday around systems in place to manage your regulations 4445, your declaration of interest, employees of the state doing business with the state. Those are some of the challenges that we have, but those are some of the critical systems that we need to start having conversation around. How are you going to get the data from AG and make sure that we are also able to assess and, proactively report some of these things. Program Director, I think I'll leave at this and we can deliberate more, obviously, on some of the criticality of this issue. Thank you.